I don't have to tell anyone in this room, because you study it, that the concept of diversity is one that has become increasingly broadened and elastic, sometimes and in some ways more precise, in many cases less precise. So each of these individuals have contributed chapters to that book, and I wanted to give you a chance to hear them talk about their research and maybe ask some questions. I don't really know that I have these in a particular order, but before I start, I wonder, it's going to involve passing on the mic one to another. If we could start and just introduce yourself with name and institution, I guess. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tamara Stevenson. I'm fourth-year assistant professor of communication and faculty fellow of diversity and inclusion at Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Good evening. I'm Michelle Samura. I'm an assistant professor and coordinator for student and community engagement at Chapman University's College of Educational Studies in Orange, California.
Good evening. I'm Courtney Carter. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and African American studies at Mississippi State University.
Good evening, I'm Angela Locks. I'm an associate professor in the College of Education at Cal State Long Beach, and I'm also the faculty director at my institution of the Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program.
Hello everyone, my name is Lando Jackson. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin, where I also direct Wisconsin's Equity and Inclusion Laboratory.
And for those of you who are wondering, when Gerlando is done with his voice, I've asked him if I can have it, because that is the most resonant, and this is coming from an alumnus of an institution that gave birth to James Earl Jones. So Gerlando, you have a voice for radio, or as my father used to say to me, you have a face for radio. Courtney, I wonder if you might start. You speak in your chapter of unpacking the mandate rhetoric of HBCU diversity discourses about both the importance of diversifying these institutions for sustainability and for legitimacy. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So in the chapter, what I do is address the larger conversation in the HBCU community about how to go about joining the diversity trend in higher education. And I point out some of the themes in that literature. And one of the themes is that HBCUs are somehow late to the conversation, that HBCUs are behind the trend of diversity. And because they're being framed as being at a deficit, then a lot of the diversity advocates are making the case for why HBCUs should embrace particularly racial diversity. And they make this argument that, first of all, it's an issue of institutional viability, since HBCUs can no longer count on African American enrollment to sustain them. But more importantly and more centrally to their argument is the idea that for HBCUs to be legitimate institutions in the 21st century, they can't be seen as spaces for Black students or spaces that are primarily made up of Black students. So a lot of the conversation that's going on in HBCUs around diversity is ways in which they can reframe themselves as places that are not so overtly Black. Right? And so the conversation then that I bring up, or the point that I bring up, is the fact that we have not yet diversified our definitions of what legitimacy constitutes. And legitimacy is still based on a model of predominantly white institutions that leaves HBCUs at this crisis of legitimacy and figuring out what to do in terms of next steps.
I don't want to give away, this is a spoiler alert, but the notion of what, in your concluding remarks, you talk about the implications for the mission of these institutions and the student experience. And these are really interesting questions, and I really appreciated you raising those in your chapter. Michelle, you speak of space, and it's a really interesting lens through which to view issues of diversity. I found a lot about it, and it caused me to look at the spaces that I inhabit. I love walking a college campus, this one or any other, but tell us a little bit about your thesis of space, but also how did you come to adopt it as a research interest?
So for as long as I can remember, there's always been something that's drawn me to trying to figure out the relationship between people and their built environments and the space around them. And so you imagine me as a kid rearranging my room every few months, trying different formations of where my bed is versus the bookshelves. And then it became a scholarly pursuit for me during my master's thesis. I chose my topic based upon conversations I was having with students, and students were telling me about these race-themed residence halls. And so I was like, what is that? Tell me more. And so I spent a couple of years looking at special interest floors in different universities and trying to understand the relationship between, say, a floor that had a particular theme, quote unquote theme, so like an Asian Pacific Islander cultural floor, and how the Asian American and Pacific Islander students who lived on that floor or who didn't live on that floor, how their racial identities were either connected to where they lived and how they navigated and negotiated that process. So in my chapter, I take those ideas and the ideas that I worked through a little bit more in my dissertation, and basically offered a think piece, a thought piece, something to have people consider. So the question that I'm posing in my chapter is, what might we be able to better understand about racial diversity and any form of diversity on college campuses through a spatial lens or a spatial perspective? So what would a lens and a language of space enable us to examine more deeply and to speak about more articulately, and then to also address? So what kind of changes can be made to space in order to change the types of interactions that are possible?
You know, I'm fascinated by that. I teach in the area of philanthropy and how we decide to name things on a campus. And oftentimes for individuals, obviously, with wealth or previous stature, it has something to do with the climate in which people find themselves. And it's really interesting. Your chapter is going to be, I think, well read, and it's very well written as well. Tamara, your chapter begins with an anecdote that describes a woman of color in front of a classroom teaching about mass communication and making reference to structural racism, I believe, and students objecting to this as something that they felt was rather put upon them. Take the story from there. What happened, and how does that form then the body of your chapter?
So that professor's name is Shannon Gibney. The name of the institution is the Minneapolis Technical and Community College, I believe the name is. This happened in November 2013. It made national headlines because, as John noted, this was an African-American female professor at a two-year college, and it was actually a white male student who objected to the very mention of the subject about structural racism. He said that in the classroom. The professor made the explanation that it was part of a larger conversation about race and racism in the United States. And the white male student continued to question the existence of that topic. In this introduction to a mass communication course, the professor said that he could seek legal counsel for his concerns and file a complaint, which he did, along with two other students. And that professor was given a letter of reprimand, and she was required to attend one-on-one diversity / some kind of management session with the chief diversity officer. So for me, this story was, again, another story, but it made headlines in the sense that it elevated the issue of what happens with Black female faculty, not just in two-year colleges, but across institutional context, about the various ways that their legitimacy and their qualifications of their work are challenged, particularly by white males in the classroom, and the lack of attention or protection that institutions don't give to this particular type of professor. So in a way, I'm continuing to study myself, even though I didn't know I was studying myself. I'm not a lifelong academic yet. This isn't my first career. But I saw parallels between my work in print and broadcast journalism and corporate communication, and now higher ed, where there, again, were so few of people who looked like me, and efforts to diversify print and broadcast journalism and now higher ed are continuing to not fulfill what they were designed to do. So what I find very interesting is my chapter continues to unpack that, and when we're talking about transforming these conversations, really bringing it to some spaces where people can relate to it. So it was a sensational story. It was a timely story for this chapter. So we're hoping that this chapter will continue that conversation in some interesting ways.
Thank you. It is a good chapter, and while it's titled to suggest that it applies mostly to women of color and community colleges, it can be generalized to many different circumstances in many different classrooms. Orlando, your chapter was of great interest to me, and one way to understand what you wrote about is to realize that only about a mile from here, there is a big house that is often filled with over 100,000 screaming people, many of them white, watching others on a football field, and as we now know, exposing themselves to all sorts of risk without much understanding of what the real experience of a college student athlete might be and the expectations that go with that. Can you tell us more that you learned from your research and what it might mean to us?
Sure.
You are aware that there is a big house down here.
I've been in the big house.
All right, thank you.
And I appreciate the question. My participation in this work and exposure to understanding the challenges for student athletes began when I was working on my master's degree at Auburn University, and I was the academic study hall monitor for the football team. And for the first time, it was clear to me the amount of scheduling that they dealt with on a daily basis, the structure, the lack of the ability to make decisions around what they wanted to do, because there was really no free time, became a reality for me. Fast forward to being on the faculty at Wisconsin, I spent 8 years a part of athletic board and learned more, which led to the project, which is linked to a program we developed called Beyond the Game, which is focused on postgraduate outcomes for student athletes. And there's a lot of assumptions about student athletes about why we perceive behaviors to be what they are. But in this particular chapter, we deal with the impact of media imagery on student athlete behavior, right? And so there's an assumption that the images that we read about in the media are purely driven by the behaviors of student athletes, and then it really characterizes how they want to experience or not experience their college degree. And so in this particular chapter, we problematize what role does the image that they know is being placed on them shape their behavior through a set of questions. And I give a quick quote to contextualize this. This is from one of the participants. "It, being negative stereotypes, kind of holds me back. I don't want to be perceived as this athlete who thinks he knows it all and sits back and let everyone do everything. You know the answer, but you don't answer, because if you get it wrong, it's like he's an athlete. He doesn't know anything. Or he thinks he knows everything. It's a double-edged sword. And so when we dig deeper into trying to understand why student athletes appear to be disengaged, much of it is, from their perspective, is the structural barriers and challenges that are inherent in the belief system of those they have to interact with. And then we have structural challenges. And so here, this student is talking about the desire to want to be fully engaged in the learning in the classroom, but feel uncomfortable because if they get it right, it's the athlete showing off again. If they get it wrong, oh, he's reinforced or she's reinforced the dumb athlete perspective. And so the more you read in this chapter, it talks about why they recluse into their self-organized groups, because they understand one another, they understand the challenges, and they can support one another in particular ways. What we have attempted to do was develop programming to draw their experiences much broader across campus, because it's a shame for student athletes to only have a relationship with such a narrow aspect of the university, that when they come back to homecoming, that they only go to the game, that they don't recognize their relationships to the academic departments or schools or any other student-based groups that they could have been a part of. And so when the coaching staff changes, then think about the level of connection to the institution will also change. And so we lose a lot when we don't try to understand the student-athlete experience from their perspective, not simply assuming that they want to be disengaged, but try to understand why they're disengaged.
And Orlando, you use a phrase, the athletic bubble, which I think is very aptly descriptive of the lifestyle of an individual that now trains in our major sports 12 months a year and is hyper-scheduled. It's a really interesting insight into not only the treatment of the media of our athletes, but also the reaction of the students to their attributed status. So a really fine piece of work, and I do appreciate it. Dr. Locke, which I actually enjoy using that phrase because Angela and I have known each other for some time. You also wrote about an aspect of the student experience, pathways, I think is the theme I drew from your chapter, especially for African American and Latino students. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, the chapter my colleagues and I wrote was actually part of a long-term program evaluation of Gear Up, which is one of several federal TRIO programs. So Gear Up in particular wants to facilitate students going into four-year institutions. And one of the nice things about Gear Up programs, be they serving 10 or 15 students in a rural part of the country or serving really district-wide for the programs that we evaluate, my colleagues and I, which includes several thousand students, is that you're required, if you have Gear Up funds, to serve the entire cohort, which means you start in 7th grade and you now follow them into the first year of college. And you providing support services developmentally appropriate in a variety of ways. But you're required to serve the entire cohort. So what my colleague Don Person and I from Cal State Fullerton, I'm at Cal State Long Beach, we were charged with coming up with an evaluation plan that was mixed methods. And so in the chapter, we feature some of our quantitative work. And what we have done, and this is, I don't know if Mark Camamora Jimenez, who works at the graduate school here, is here today. He was here yesterday. But Mark had this bright idea. He picked up the phone and called me one afternoon several years ago, many years ago at this point, and said, hey, what do you think about trying to adapt SERP? It's a UCLA Higher Education Research Institute, the freshman survey that's widely used in higher education research, and Sylvia Hurtado's Diverse Democracy Survey, and trying to adapt it to what we need to do for Gear Up. And I thought, great, tell me more. Told me a little bit about what he needed to do, and I said, all right, Mark, you and I are new, we're fresh. I think Mark was finishing his doctorate, I was in my first year, and at around the same time, Don Person had contacted him and said, you know, I'm interested in doing this work with you. And I said, well, we need to involve Don because you and I don't know what we're doing. So that was actually a good learning moment, I think, for both Mark and I. But essentially, we have done survey work with the students in 8th, 10th, and 12th grade. We combine that with school district records, their course-taking patterns. Something in California that's really important is something called A through G requirements. It's the gateway to going to college, as well as parent surveys, peer interviews, teacher interviews, to get a complete picture of what's going on and what are the things that support or diminish students going on to college. So the particular chapter looked at what promotes students taking advanced algebra in the 8th grade, which is still a gateway to going to college for students in the US. And then we also looked at degree aspirations in the 10th grade. And you can get the book, or if you email me, I will send you some PowerPoints of different presentations so you can learn about the results of the regression work that we're doing. But I think what's the connection for this particular project to the book is the evaluation team at Dawn's Center for Research on Evaluation of Educational Leadership and Educational Access at CSU Fullerton is this multi-ethnic, very diverse research team. So the people that actually contributed to making this chapter possible are disproportionately first-generation undergrad and graduate students. They're all multilingual for the most part. Many of them have a recent immigrant experience. And so it's this very, very diverse team of people that have made this work possible. And then the other way we bring in diversity is who gets to play ball at the evaluation table and inform that conversation. And so community partners, school district partners and leaders, principals, assistant principals, teachers, as well as students and parents all inform how it is we shape our evaluation research agenda. And so I think that that's the connection to the book, is that the sense of community that has made this work possible is, I think, really important and also very different.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it reminds us that who is brought into this research, who's at the table, so to speak, does shape the outcome. It kind of turns this Newtonian positivist view on its head, that there's something objective. And Michelle, your work on spaces, my guess is that different people can walk into different spaces and perceive them quite differently. And so how things are framed and reported makes a difference. And that was another interesting feature of this particular book that's about to come out. Kind of feels like I'm selling it today, and I really don't intend to, but we actually asked our graduate students at the University of Michigan to interview these individuals and to learn from them how they took the journey from graduate school into to these roles. I don't know if any of those graduate students are here in the room. Are there? And yes, Talia, were you one of the interviewers? You have your mouth full anyhow. The thing about graduate students, I don't know if you've noticed this, they actually graduate and move on, and then you can't find them. But the interspersed among the chapters you've just heard described are interview narratives of a young scholar interviewing, I hate to say senior scholar, it's not entirely fair, but how did you get there? You know, and we really found that in the context of our own work, this is a contribution made by Dr. Marie Ting, but we were just starting in our time at the National Center. It created a lot of excitement for students to hear, hey, I could be doing that, and that process is not so far off. Courtney, let me ask you, the concept behind this book was how is our understanding, our meaning of diversity changing over these last several years? Can you say a word about how your chapter might inform that question? How is diversity changing?
I think one of the interesting things that comes out of the diversity literature, if you're looking at higher education or even diversity rhetoric and this kind of everyday diversity talk, is that there's always a limit to the amount of difference that people are willing to tolerate, and that kind of gets lost in our conversations about diversity in higher education, because we're talking about embracing everyone and embracing everything, but if you scratch the surface, there's usually a margin where certain people occupy, and it's not that kind of diversity that we want. And by looking at HBCUs, we're looking at institutions that are known for having educated the people that we don't necessarily want involved in higher education, that kind of diversity that we haven't always embraced, low income, first generation, African Americans, although HBCUs have always been racially heterogeneous spaces. They've never been spaces that have prohibited non-blacks from attending. But looking at diversity with this attention to power dynamics and who it is we don't want and what kinds of difference we don't want included is a new way, or a really important way, to push our conversations about diversity and how it's actually practiced in institutions.
One of the purposes of this gathering is to examine where we are in the formation of either a discipline of diversity studies or an interdisciplinary area, and yet this very basic question of how do we define the thing we're describing is something that we're going to have to be working on, I think, for some time. And it's at moments like this, I'm glad I'm such a young man and will be able to, why are you laughing? Of course I am. But there are others who are going to have to take this up, and of course the definition will keep changing. Angela, I really appreciated what you said about the excitement you felt about working in a research team where it itself represented different perspectives. How did that improve the quality of the work? Aside from it being perhaps a more enjoyable experience, how did that contribute to better work?
Well, it's what businesses have long known. It's what we discovered through the social science research and the affirmative action cases a few years ago, that when you have diverse viewpoints informed by people's lived experiences and different ways of knowing and experience the world come together, that you have a richer conversation, a richer product, and not just to be product focused, although that's what we were being paid to do as the evaluation team. You also have richer conversations and learning opportunities. So there's kind of this multi-level learning that happens from undergrads, graduate students, both masters and doctoral, as well as the faculty that were involved in the evaluation. And I think that probably the greatest teachers on the research team were the undergraduate students. And I'm a big proponent of undergraduate research. I've benefited from it greatly. I've been involved in research teams since I was literally 19 years old. And so I know the richness of that experience. And the undergrads are just, they're experiencing different things. They're closer in age to the very students whose trajectory to college we were examining. And so there was just a richness there. And because we operated on a pretty flat hierarchy in terms of getting some of the research work done, the undergraduates, the youngest people chronologically in the room often, felt the most empowered to speak up and to challenge the faculty and the graduate students. And so that created learning opportunities, again, for us as faculty and graduate students. And so I just think when you have, again, it's not just about having compositional diversity on research teams, but it's empowering people that are a part of your research team to bring their lived experience and perspective and ways of knowing and living in the world to the research conversation. And that's, I think, what makes the work so rich.
Thank you. Lando, this may put you in an awkward position, but I know how savvy you are. You'll tell me if you can't answer. The state of Wisconsin and the University of Wisconsin have been under our thoughtful and caring countenance because of the extraordinary pressures put on the institution. Political pressures, I think is there safe to say, is their origination. Do things like that influence research agendas inside the institution? And how do they affect climate and relationships in your experience?
Very good question. I did, maybe a week before last, I did a op-ed piece that provided my observations around the trio of challenges that Wisconsin, UW-Madison, within the context of the system, is dealing with. The first one is that Wisconsin enjoyed some very strong protections around tenure and shared governance because they were in state statute and in effect state law, which is a pretty strong statement for a state to make that tenure should be a part of state law. There has been a decision at the Board of Regents level that took both of those out of state law and made those system policy. On the surface, it's normalizing it, right? Most states don't have it in state law. It's their policies and in many effects, it's a normalizing process. The second part of what's going on now to create this environment is that over the last academic year, there has been approximately 65 hate bias incidences on campus, many racially motivated, and for a campus that has a liberal, welcoming type history, to deal with this in basically an academic year, almost a complete shift, it's created some challenging spaces for a lot of people, to say the least. Then the third is that we've had a formal vote of no confidence against the UW system president and Board of Regents. Madison was the first institution, and then other institutions in the system are lining up to do such a thing. So we have an environment that feels pretty different right now. Does it potentially impact the kind of work that goes on? Absolutely. When you have research, when your tenure is in the state statute and you have shared governance in state statute, where you have state rights to be involved in key decision making related to academics and research, and that goes away, that changes a lot. When your tenure structure changes in a way that it did, it reverses what the Board of Regents did well over 100 years ago that led to a statement that we all refer to as sifting and winnowing, right? So the Board of Regents made one of the first statements for academic freedom when they put a statement in the state statute that said that, and this is translation, that whatever research may not be welcomed in other states is welcomed at the great state University of Wisconsin. This is a reversal. And so many faculty feel that they don't have those same protections. There have been departures. There are probably more departures underway. And the system, the leadership, have to really make some decisions about how they plan to respond. How are they planning to address the challenges that are immediately before them, particularly around the climate dynamic, around race, gender, and difference. But what will be the response as it relates to protection regarding to research? And so there's a great deal of concern. There's a lot of discussion, dialogue. On Monday, I have a meeting with the chancellor about this. And then later today, actually, there's another piece that's coming out where I actually problematize what's going on with around these policies, which begging the question, what is the role of a world-class public university versus a very good state flagship? And in some ways, what's happening at Wisconsin will begin to tinker or is tinkering with ingredients that allowed it to be among the few public institutions to reach a world-class status that legitimately is able to compete against top privates and global institutions. When you remove those protections, you know, it does affect desirability for great talent to find it a desirable place. So I pose that question. Delaware recently may be following suit because they just passed, they just voted by their board to remove certain decision-making authority from the faculty senate and put it in the provost's office, right? So, you know, you begin to tinker with, you know, the types of things that make it desirable and important to do good research, but particularly research that could be deemed controversial.
At last evening's panel, there was this, I think, really important discussion about whether faculty of color could afford to rock the boat or to be engaged in disruptive practices. And I'm glad you related the story that you did, because something that we need to hang on to across the profession is this awareness that what happens in one part of the system ultimately will affect all the other parts as well. And whether it's academic freedom or trigger warnings in the classroom, all of these things are related in some fashion or another, and we seldom think of ourselves as being responsible to protect one another in situations like this. Michelle, I have a very difficult question for you. It's the kind of question asked at the end of your dissertation defense when someone says, I want you to go beyond, slightly beyond what you wrote in your chapter and extrapolate it to another kind of problem. In a year, we will be celebrating the 200th anniversary of the University of Michigan. Despite appearances, I was not there for its birthing. But nonetheless, one of the challenges in which we're caught up is how do you represent a long institutional history that includes moments of great pride and moments of disappointment? Because not everything that we've done over the course of this history is perfectly consistent with our highest values today. So you think a lot about spaces. How do you represent spaces on the campus that either traditionally or even in a contemporary way send a signal that they're not welcoming for individuals? And they may be spaces literally on the campus or in the fraternity houses just off the campus. You know, problematize your work a little bit. Not all spaces are equally welcoming. Like a good trained witness, she wrote down the question and then consulted her lawyer. If she now takes the fifth, we'll know that you've been before the grand jury more times than you should.
There are 2 points that I'd like to make in response to your difficult question. The first is bringing up this concept that sociologist Caroline Knowles has raised about space as being an active archive. And so she, in her writing, she has a text called, I think it's Race and Social Analysis, talks about how space has these layers of meaning, and oftentimes those layers are historical, and that a single space at any particular moment in time has all that built into it. So you have a space that previously 200 years ago looks very different than 100 years ago, looks very different than 50, 20 years ago until the present. And the aspect of space that or spatial approaches that I think is particularly intriguing and useful for research on diversity and efforts around diversity is that because space is socially constructed, space can be changed. And that change, and that the social is actually spatially constructed as well. And so you can actually change what's possible, the types of interactions that are possible by changing spaces. And this kind of brings me to my second point. I guess it's a point. I'm actually doing research now on the relationship between space and the development of student belonging in residence halls. And one of the really interesting things I've been finding so far is that as I'm talking with different students, the exact same space is experienced very differently by different people at different times. And so if we're thinking about, okay, so what kind of changes could be made to space, and I've been having conversations with our campus architects and our campus planners and designers, and they're pushing me to be as concrete as possible about, okay, so what do you mean by spatial changes and social changes and that type of thing? And where we're at now, and this is in progress, this is kind of pushing me to think a little ahead, is thinking about, I'm calling them spatial cues, but maybe there's certain ways that programs, definitely building design, spatial designs, interior design could be developed that help to more facilitate belonging than hinder it. And those things can be changed over time depending on who comes through that space and who's using it. Does that make sense?
It really does, and it's particularly helpful. We're also experimenting with the notion of multiple perspectives. You reference them to space. We might reference them to events. But this building, for instance, the Michigan Union, one of the first historic unions in the country, did not allow women through the front door for many of its first years, and resulted ultimately in women coming together for the first higher education philanthropic effort led by women to create the Michigan League, another building far more beautiful, I think, than this one, that was for them. So we have these examples, and the history falls away, but the space remains. So I really appreciated your question. Is there any? Yes, please. Thank you. Yeah.
Space and place, so I have that bias. But there have been a lot of news in higher ed about the naming of spaces. So you get at Yale and Calhoun College, you get Woodrow Wilson at Princeton and all these other places. So can you talk about maybe the relationship between names of places, the built environment of places, and maybe, I don't know, similarly, can you talk even further than your work and just comment on the state of higher ed? It's not a hard question at all.
The state of higher ed through a spatial perspective.
Yeah.
Well, one of the questions I actually ask of students in focus groups that I do, as well as I don't give cameras to students anymore, they have cell phones, and so they take pictures, and I have students do photojournaling projects as part of a research methodology. But one of the questions I ask is, which spaces on campus, or right now I'm looking at res halls, go by a name other than their formal name. And so, because part of what I'm trying to understand are the ways that students may take a particular space that maybe has this very long formal name and change it into something that works for them or that contests that space, actually. And to me, one of the interesting pieces of what I've been finding so far are the ways that students are reappropriating spaces for their own use, and in some ways contesting meanings that maybe the university, the trustees, the architects and designers initially intended it to be, but saying that's not working for us, so this is what we're going to name it and call it amongst ourselves, so no one knows it by the formal name, they all know it by something else. And this is how we're going to use that space because we're taking that on. We're kind of creating an ownership.
Seems like there's a lot of potential in your work, not only in dealing with these immediate problems, but the whole notion of planning for space. We're about to build a new multicultural center just a few hundred feet from here, and it's fascinating to think what that kind of space should be planned for and how it should operate. I just have one more question for Tamara, and then we can go out into this brilliant sunshine while it still is there for us. Tamara, you said something this evening that struck me. You were studying African American women teaching in college classrooms, and you said, perhaps I'm studying myself. Say something about that for us.
So a few words or phrases that I heard from my colleagues here. One, academic freedom. Two, spaces. And it made me think about microaggressions, macroaggressions, environmental microaggressions, academic freedom. So going back to the story about Shannon Gibney and the incident that sought to suppress her academic freedom by reprimanding her, by giving more institutional protection to these students as opposed to this faculty member for a legitimate subject in this course, when you talked about academic spaces, and one example of an environmental microaggression would be the pictures on the wall. And if there are pictures on the wall and they don't look like you, does that convey a message of belonging, or does that convey a message of exclusion? As I mentioned earlier, I am at a small liberal arts college in Salt Lake City, Utah. I am the first African-American faculty member in my department. Out of 155 faculty, I am the only African-American female professor there. I've been at that institution 4 years. I was brought in as part of a postdoctoral fellowship. After the first year, they asked me to stay on and in a full-time capacity. So there's not many of me in higher ed. Most are at least for my study, in which I looked at, the chapter is an excerpt from my study where I interviewed 13 female faculty members at public two-year colleges, 7 male faculty members at two-year colleges, 6 public two-year colleges in a particular metro area, looking at their race-related role stressors. So I used critical race theory, racial battle fatigue, role strain, and again, racial micro and macroaggressions. And so the results of that study gave me some ideas of how to handle my spaces, or to an extent to at least understand what's happening when a microaggression happens, when a macroaggression happens. What are the psychological, physiological, and behavioral expressions am I dealing with when those things happen, and how do I begin to think about that? How do I begin to negotiate my space, my continuation of my work at Westminster, which does not have a tenure system. It used to have one in the 1980s, but it almost bankrupted the institution. So now we have a contract process there, and still a promotion process. So there's more to do because there's not many of me. There just still isn't. And while there may be parallels for women of color and men of color as well, there is a distinct, I would still say, systematic processes to render Black female faculty invisible. Even in this space that I've been in for the past 2 days, folks have been they're excited about the work they're doing, but they frame it as women and ethnic minorities. Women and ethnic minorities. And I go, where am I in that? Because I'm both. When we talk about what's happening with the sexual assault happening on college campuses, and we talk about Title IX, Title VI, Title IX, where am I in that? Where can I be in that? Because I'm both. So I got a lot to learn about myself.
Well, I hope
academically, professionally as well.
I hope you'll continue on that theme. Some would argue that every story we tell in one way or another is a story of ourselves. And I think there has to be something that touches us in the research we do, whether as the survey we did in advance of this gathering suggests, a passion for social justice or a passion for self-discovery and self-exploration. Whatever it is that you can hold on to keep this work alive in you and therefore in the field, it's important. I do want to suggest that this book project that we launched, which we thought we could wrap up in about a year, it's been about 2 years or more, we never intended it to be a singular activity. Being with you the last couple of days, I'm aware of all the promising research that is represented by what you're doing here in this room. If there are those of you who have research activities or findings or chapters that you think deserve greater attention that they're getting, please let us know. We actually have established mechanisms for making them available through our website. And some of the interviews that you've done in the last day or so, those will also be online. We are not trying to appropriate all of your work to the University of Michigan. We are trying to use the privileged position that we have at Michigan to extend the boundaries of this field. We think this is one of the ways we can make a contribution. So whether you feel as if you want to contribute or simply stay in touch, we hope you will do so. And if there's energy for producing a second volume, there's no energy on my staff, everyone's shaking their head, but if there's energy for producing a second volume, it begins with an idea. It begins with somebody having an idea of how certain research activities can be held together with meaning. And we'd be happy to try and facilitate that with and for you, for the benefit of everyone outside of this room who needs to know about what you're doing. I want to thank my panelists. Thank you for your generous answers and your willingness to take on my questions. Yes.
Really quick, we also, well, I'm going to speak on behalf, I'm not, so, and then maybe you can join in after, but wanted to thank Penny Pasquet, our editor,
yes,
who pulled this together, Noe Ortega, Marie Ting, and obviously you for the hard work, but Penny in particular for
Penny
for working
is
closely
a
with
wonder.
us.
Penny was the first doctoral student I hired when I came to the University of Michigan. And she was working elsewhere on campus. And I'm Irish, I tell a lot of stories, and some of them are true. This one happens to be true. I had to borrow a chair from across the hall so that we both could sit down and talk. And Penny has just gone on. She's at Oklahoma, where she's a named university professor and amazing, amazing scholar. So anyone who crosses paths with Penny Pasquet, first of all, tell her John says he loves her and publicly articulates that, but also you are in for a treat. She's just a terrific person. Thanks for recognizing Penny, and Noe Ortega, and Marie Ting, who is out of town tonight in Oregon, but will be back tomorrow. Thank you all very much. Thanks for spending such a long day with us.